The year is 1440, the city is Nantes, and the silence in this cold stone chamber is absolute. It is a silence of disbelief, of a world turned upside down. The man standing before the court is no common criminal. He is a lord of France, a marshal of the army, a man whose wealth is surpassed only by the king himself. He is Gilles de Rais, a name that, until this moment, meant only one thing: hero. But the charges read out on this day are not of heroism. They are of a darkness so profound it has no name. At first, the accusations are familiar evils of the age: witchcraft, alchemy, forbidden knowledge, sins to be sure, but understandable sins for a man desperate to reclaim his lost fortune. The court listens and waits, but then the list continues, and the true nature of the horror begins to bleed through. The court records state that over 140 children were missing from the lands surrounding his castles. Other accounts claim the number was closer to 800. Boys and girls, lured from their homes with promises of food or work, taken to a remote fortress and never seen again. Their hands, their eyes, their hearts, offered up in blood rituals to a demon named Baron. This is the man who stood beside a saint, the man who saved France. He begins to speak, not to deny the charges, but to confess. And with his confession, the hero in the stained glass window is shattered forever. How did the angel of France fall so far? How did the nation's savior become its most terrifying monster? Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark myths, strange histories, and forgotten legends are worth remembering, if you believe the mysteries of our past should not be lost, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we open the case file on Gilles de Rais. We will trace his path from a holy warrior fighting beside a saint to a predator who sacrificed children to a demon. We will examine the horrifying eyewitness accounts from his castles, the dark rituals he conducted in secret, and the sensational trial that unmasked a monster hiding in a hero's skin. This is not only the story of a serial killer, it is the story of the thin line between piety and blasphemy, between glory and damnation. It is the story of an ancient evil that found a new, aristocratic form. To understand this medieval nightmare, we must first travel back in time, to the crucible of war that gave the legend his name. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the monster, you must first understand the hero. You have to stand in his shadow, feel the weight of his glory, and see the world through his eyes. And in the fractured, war-torn kingdom of 15th century France, few heroes cast a longer shadow or burned with a more brilliant light than Gilles de Rais. He wasn't born a king, but he might as well have been. He was the product of a union between two of the most powerful families in Brittany, the de Rais and the de Montmorency Laval. This was old money, land hoarding, power brokering aristocracy at its most formidable. By the time Gilles was just 20 years old, a series of convenient deaths and shrewd inheritances had funneled the wealth of multiple dynasties directly into his hands. The result was a fortune so vast it was genuinely obscene. He was, without any exaggeration, one of the richest men in all of Europe, with an income that dwarfed even that of the French king. He owned a sprawling network of castles, fortresses and manors that formed a private kingdom across the French countryside. He had his own army, his own court, and his own treasury. In a world defined by a rigid hierarchy of power, Gilles de Rais started the game near the very top. But this kind of wealth and power comes with its own kind of poison. He was orphaned as a child and became the ward of his maternal grandfather, a man named Jean de Craon. De Craon was a notoriously ruthless political operator, a man who saw his grandson not as a child to be nurtured, but as a strategic asset to be forged. He instilled in Gilles a deep contempt for authority and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. Gilles was taught that the rules that governed lesser men simply did not apply to him. His education was a masterclass in the tools of power. He spoke fluent Latin. He debated philosophy. He understood the intricate mechanics of courtly politics. But most importantly, he was trained for war. He was taught that violence, when wielded correctly, was not a sin, but a tool, the ultimate expression of will. The result of this upbringing was a young man of terrifying contradictions. On the one hand, he was a celebrated patron of the arts, a man with a refined taste for music and literature who could charm any court in Europe. On the other, he was a creature of pure, unrestrained appetite. His rages were the stuff of legend. His spending was so lavish it bordered on madness. He did nothing in moderation. If he was generous, he was giving away fortunes. If he was angry, he was drawing his sword. He was a man who had never been told no, who had never known failure, and who had been raised to believe he was a creature set apart from the rest of humanity, accountable only to God. He was a golden prince, a prodigy of his age, simmering with an intensity that had not yet found a proper outlet. But in the brutal landscape of the 100 Years' War, he was about to find one. The France that Gilles de Rais grew up in was a nation tearing itself apart. The 100 Years' War was not a single, continuous conflict, but a festering, century-long wound. It was a relentless cycle of sieges, raids, and bloody battles against the English, complicated by a vicious civil war between the French factions of Armagnac and Burgundy. It was an age of chaos, where loyalty was a commodity and violence was the only language everyone understood. For a young nobleman bred for conflict, it was a paradise. Gilles plunged into this world with the same ferocious energy he applied to everything else. He wasn't a cautious commander who directed battles from the rear. He was a frontline warrior, a physical prodigy in a full suit of plate armor who led cavalry charges himself. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural instinct for the geometry of the battlefield, earning a reputation as a commander who was as brilliant as he was fearless. But his greatest asset was his piety. Before a battle, he would spend hours in his tent in fervent prayer, and then ride out onto the field to commit acts of appalling violence in the name of God. To the modern mind, this is a jarring contradiction, but in the 15th century, this was the very essence of the chivalric ideal. He was the perfect Christian knight, a man who could slaughter his enemies with a clear conscience, believing he was doing God's holy work. His faith wasn't a comfort, it was a weapon, and it made him incredibly dangerous. He quickly became a respected veteran, a key commander in the service of the Dauphin, the uncrowned and disinherited heir to the French throne. But his efforts and the efforts of men like him felt like trying to hold back the tide. By 1429, the situation was catastrophic. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled Paris and all of northern France. The French army was a demoralized, beaten force. The Dauphin was hiding in his court at Chinon, a king of a shrinking, fractured kingdom. The great city of Orléans, the strategic key to the whole of France, was under siege and on the verge of surrender. All hope was lost. The war was, for all intents and purposes, over. France was about to be erased from the map. And then into this fog of despair, a miracle appeared. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, a teenage peasant girl from a forgotten village who claimed that she spoke to God. She said that angels had given her a divine mission to break the siege of Orléans, to drive the English out of France, and to see the Dauphin crowned king at the holy city of Reims, as was tradition. To the jaded, cynical nobles of the French court, it was madness. They saw a delusional farm girl, a heretic, or at best a useful pawn for a desperate propaganda campaign. But Gilles de Rais saw something else entirely. When he looked at Joan, he didn't see a peasant. He saw a living saint. For a man like Gilles, whose entire being was wired for intense, all-consuming passion, this was a moment of profound, life-altering revelation. His piety was not gentle or contemplative. It was a roaring fire. He had spent his life searching for a cause worthy of the immense force of his personality. In the holy war offered by Joan, he found it. Here was a purpose pure enough, grand enough to contain him. He saw in her the divine made flesh, and he became her most fervent, most loyal, and most powerful disciple. He threw his entire fortune behind her cause. He paid for troops, for supplies, for weapons. He became her personal protector, her military advisor, and her fiercest champion at the royal court. The veteran war hero and the teenage visionary formed one of the most unlikely and most effective partnerships in military history. She was the divine strategist, pointing the way with God's guidance. He was her sword arm, the seasoned commander who knew how to turn her visions into brutal battlefield reality. Together, they were about to change the world. What happened next is the stuff of legend, a sequence of events so miraculous it feels like fiction. At Orléans, the French army, inspired by Joan's presence and guided by Gilles' tactical command, did the impossible. In a series of daring assaults, they shattered the English fortifications and broke a siege that had lasted for months. The city was saved. It was a stunning, unbelievable victory that sent a shockwave across Europe. That single victory lit a fire in the soul of France. Suddenly, the beaten, demoralized army believed it was invincible, an instrument of God's will. The momentum was unstoppable. With Joan at the head of the army and Gilles at her side, they launched a breathtakingly audacious campaign. They swept through the Loire Valley, retaking city after city from the stunned English garrisons. At the Battle of Patay, they achieved another miracle. Using a brilliant and aggressive strategy, they annihilated the main English army in the field, a victory so total it reversed a century of French defeats. The path was now clear for the most important part of Joan's mission. They marched deep into enemy territory, all the way to the cathedral city of Reims. It was there, in the ancient church where French kings had been crowned for 1,000 years. that the Dauphin finally became King Charles VII. It was a moment of supreme triumph, the culmination of a holy crusade. Joan of Arc stood beside her king, her banner in hand, and nearby, watching her, was Gilles de Rais, a man who had helped make it all possible. For his service, for his loyalty, for his genius on the battlefield, the new king gave him the highest military honor in the nation. He was named Marshal of France. This was the summit of his life. At just 25 years old, he was a national hero, a living legend, a man celebrated as the savior of his country. He was rich, powerful, and respected. He was the hero in the stained glass window, a knight in shining armor who had fought beside a saint and restored a king to his throne. He had everything a man could possibly dream of. It was a perfect, glorious moment, and it was the last truly good moment he would ever have. The problem with flying close to the sun is that you can get burned. The king, now secure on his throne, had little use for the peasant girl who had put him there. Her piety and popularity made him uncomfortable. The other nobles at court, who had once dismissed her, were now consumed with a venomous jealousy. The Grand Crusade began to stall, bogged down by political infighting and the king's own cowardice. When Joan was captured in battle by Burgundian soldiers, allies of the English, the king did nothing. He made no effort to ransom her, no attempt to rescue her. Gilles de Rais was frantic. He was a Marshal of France, a man of immense power and influence, yet he found himself blocked at every turn. He pleaded with the king. He tried to raise his own army, to launch a private rescue mission. But it was no use. The political machine he had served so well had turned against him. The hero who had saved an entire kingdom was rendered utterly powerless to save the one person who had given his life meaning. He was forced to stand by and watch as the English and the very same church he had fought for put his saint on trial for heresy. He heard the verdict. He knew the sentence. He was in the city of Rouen on May the 30th, 1431. Hidden in the crowd, he watched as they tied the 19-year-old girl to a tall wooden stake in the marketplace. He watched as they lit the kindling at her feet. He watched as the flames rose, consuming the woman he believed was a messenger from God. He saw the fire reflected in his own eyes, and in that moment, something inside him broke. The fire didn't just take Joan, it took his faith, it took his purpose, it took the entire moral compass of his world and burned it all to ash. What happens to a man who has flown so close to the sun when the light suddenly goes out? The fire that took Joan of Arc in the marketplace of Rouen did not kill Gilles de Rais, but it burned away everything he had once been. The hero, the patriot, the pious soldier, all of it turned to ash. What crawled out of that fire was something else entirely. A man hollowed out by grief, poisoned by cynicism, and haunted by the ghost of a world he no longer believed in. He abandoned the royal court, a place now filled with the bitter taste of betrayal. He resigned his command in the army, the life of a soldier now a meaningless charade. He retreated from the world of men and politics and sealed himself away inside the stone walls of his favorite castle, the fortress of Tiffauges. And there, in the echoing silence of his own private kingdom, he began a frantic, desperate quest to fill the God-sized void that had opened up in his soul. He tried to fill it with beauty. He commissioned breathtaking tapestries and priceless works of art. He hired his own personal choir, a company of singers so skilled they were said to rival the Pope's own, and had them follow him from room to room, singing day and night to drown out the silence. He also tried to fill it with noise. He threw open the gates of his castle to an army of sycophants, hangers-on, and fellow aristocrats. He hosted lavish, decadent feasts that lasted for days, orgies of food and wine designed to numb the senses. But this wasn't the joyful excess of a man celebrating his life. It was the frantic, panicked spending of a man running from his own thoughts. He was surrounding himself with a wall of luxury, sound, and people, hoping it would be thick enough to keep his memories at bay. It wasn't. The ghost of his former glory was always there, whispering in the quiet moments, reminding him of what he had once been. And soon, his grief and his ego would combine to create a monument to his own past, an obsession that would become the talk of the entire kingdom. Every man is the hero of his own story, but Gilles de Rais was no longer content with that. He decided to make his story everyone else's reality, in what can only be described as a spectacular act of narcissistic obsession. He wrote a play, a sprawling, epic theatrical production titled Le Siège d'Orléans, The Siege of Orléans. It was a dramatic retelling of his finest hour, a celebration of his glorious campaign alongside Joan of Arc. He wasn't just the author, he was the producer, the director, and, in a way, the star. This was not some small amateur production. Gilles approached it with the same boundless manic intensity he had once applied to warfare. He hired a cast of over 500 actors. He commissioned a wardrobe of impossibly lavish costumes made from silk, velvet, and cloth of gold. He built elaborate, life-sized sets that recreated the battlements of Orléans. He even had a special musical score composed just for the play. The production was, by any measure, the most ambitious and expensive piece of theatre ever staged in medieval Europe. He took the play on a tour across France, forcing the nobles and townspeople of Orléans and other cities to sit for hours and watch his own life story, his own heroism, play out before them. He would often play himself in the lead role. It was a staggering display of ego, a man so desperate to recapture the feeling of his own glory that he was willing to bankrupt himself to stage a fictional version of it. The play was his escape, a way to live inside the one moment in his life where everything had made sense, where he had been a true hero fighting for a holy cause. But the real world, with its debts and its consequences, was closing in. The play about his greatest victory was ironically causing his greatest defeat, his own financial ruin. He had spent a fortune so vast on this single production that it would have been enough to fund a real military campaign. The Golden Prince was running out of gold. For generations, the de Rais family had built an empire of land and wealth. In a few short years of manic spending, Gilles had set that empire on fire. His relatives watched in horror as he sold off castles, mortgaged ancient family lands, and took out crippling loans to fund his increasingly unhinged lifestyle. They saw their legacy, their future, being squandered on a theatre production. They had to act. In 1435, they did something drastic. They went to the king. They presented evidence of Gilles's catastrophic spending and petitioned to have him declared financially incompetent. King Charles, the very man Gilles had helped crown, agreed. He issued a royal decree that forbade Gilles de Rais from selling or mortgaging any more of his lands. All of his financial transactions would now have to be approved by a royal council. For Gilles, this was a humiliation beyond imagining. He, the Marshal of France, the Lion of Orléans, was now being treated like a reckless child who couldn't be trusted with his own allowance. His pride, the very core of his being, was deeply wounded. But the decree did something else. It cornered him. It cut off his access to conventional streams of money. He was still a rich man, but his assets were frozen and his debts were piling up like a rising tide. He was facing the one thing he had never known: limitation. He was trapped in a gilded cage, and the walls were closing in. A man like Gilles de Rais would not accept such a fate. If the world of men and the laws of the king would not give him what he wanted, he would find a power that would. Gilles had lost his faith in the Christian God, the God who had sent a saint only to allow her to be burned, the God who had rewarded his loyal service with betrayal and public humiliation. His piety, once a raging fire, was now a bed of cold ash. But a man of such intense passions does not simply become an atheist. When a void of faith appears, he seeks something else to fill it. If God had failed him, perhaps the other side had something to offer. His obsession shifted from the theatre to the library. He turned his boundless energy towards the occult, to the world of forbidden knowledge. He began with alchemy, the ancient art of transmutation. The idea captivated his ego. The philosopher's stone, the legendary substance that could turn base metals into pure gold, was the perfect solution to all his problems. It was a secret, magical path to infinite wealth. It was a power that came not from kings or councils, but from hidden knowledge. It was a way to become a god in his own right, a master of the very elements of creation. He converted a chamber in his castle at Tiffauges into a sprawling alchemical laboratory. He spent another fortune hunting down rare and esoteric texts from across Europe. He hired a small army of self-proclaimed alchemists, mystics, and scholars. They filled his castle with the acrid smell of strange chemicals, their days spent over bubbling cauldrons and cryptic charts, all in pursuit of the great work. But for all their efforts, for all the money he burned, the lead in his crucibles remained stubbornly lead. The gold never appeared. His frustration grew into a cold fury. He was failing, and Gilles de Rais did not tolerate failure. He realized he needed more than a scholar. He needed a true master. He needed a sorcerer. He sent his most trusted agents across Europe with a simple, chilling mission: find someone who could actually deliver on the promises of the dark arts. They returned from Florence with a man named Francesco Prelati. Prelati was not some wild-eyed charlatan. He was a cleric, educated and articulate, a man of immense charm and intelligence. He was also a masterful con artist and a student of demonology, who saw in the desperate, fabulously wealthy French nobleman the opportunity of a lifetime. Prelati arrived at Tiffauges and quickly took measure of his new patron. He saw the grief, the towering ego, the simmering rage, and the bottomless pit of desperation. He understood that Gilles didn't just want gold. He wanted power. He wanted validation. He wanted to undo the humiliation the world had inflicted on him. Playing the part of a wise and powerful sorcerer, Prelati patiently listened to Gilles' frustrations with alchemy. He nodded, he sympathized, and then, when the moment was right, he leaned in and shared a secret. He told Gilles that alchemy was a fool's game, a slow, uncertain science for patient men. Why, he asked, Would a man of Gilles' stature waste his time trying to make gold when he could simply ask for it? Prelati claimed he had a more direct method. He said he possessed the knowledge to summon a powerful entity, a demon named Baron. This demon, Prelati explained with a confident smile, held dominion over the treasures of the earth. He could reveal the locations of hidden fortunes, grant knowledge of the future, and give them power beyond their wildest dreams. All they had to do was summon him and prove their loyalty. But, Prelati warned, his eyes glittering, such a powerful being would not answer their call for nothing. He would demand a tribute, an offering, a price. Gilles de Rais had lost his faith in a god who took everything from him. Now, a devil was at his door, offering him the world. The only question was, what was the price? Francesco Prelati was not a sorcerer. He was something far more dangerous, a student of the human soul. He was a master of observation, a psychologist in an age before the term existed, and a theatrical showman of the highest order. When he looked at Gilles de Rais, he didn't see a Marshal of France. He saw a perfect instrument, a man whose grief, ego, and bottomless desperation could be played upon like a lute. And so, in the cold, locked chambers of Tiffauges, the grand deception began. Prelati's rituals were masterpieces of stagecraft. He understood that to hook a man like Gilles, the magic had to feel real, tantalizing, and just on the verge of a breakthrough. He would burn rare herbs and chemical powders that filled the room with strange-colored smoke and flashes of brilliant light. He used polished mirrors, angled just so, to create the illusion of fleeting, shadowy figures in the darkness. He would speak his incantations in a mix of real Latin, garbled Greek, and pure gibberish, his voice rising to a fever pitch that was genuinely hypnotic. The demon, Baron, was always just out of reach. His voice was a faint, indecipherable whisper that Prelati would translate. His form was a momentary distortion in a dark corner. Prelati was not summoning a demon from hell. He was summoning one from the depths of Gilles' own desperate imagination. And Gilles, a man who had seen a living saint on the battlefield, was already primed to believe in miracles. He was hooked. After weeks of these tantalizing but ultimately fruitless sessions, Prelati knew the time was right to raise the stakes. He prepared for his greatest performance. During one ritual, he fell to the floor in a convincing, violent trance. His voice changed, becoming a low, guttural growl. He was now channeling the demon Baron, and the demon, speaking through him, was angry. It scoffed at their pathetic offerings of animal hearts and goat's blood. Such things were an insult. A being of its power, Baron growled, fed on something far more potent. It fed on the essence of life itself, the pure, uncorrupted energy found only in a being of great innocence and value. Prelati, coming out of his trance, sweating and exhausted, presented this not as his own idea, but as a terrible, unavoidable demand from a powerful and impatient entity. He played his part perfectly, wringing his hands, speaking of the terrible cost of this kind of magic. He skillfully framed it as the final, horrifying test of Gilles' resolve. Infinite wealth and power were on the other side of the door, but the key to unlocking it was forged in an act of ultimate blasphemy. He made Gilles feel that the choice was his, and his alone. The sorcerer was merely a guide. It was Gilles who had to be brave enough, ruthless enough, to pay the demon its price. The first victim was brought to the castle. The coven had been assembled. The crime was committed. In the immediate sickening aftermath of the murder, as the reality of what he had done began to crash down on Gilles, Prelati knew he could not allow a moment for regret to set in. He immediately launched into his final, most convincing illusion. He cried out that the sacrifice had been accepted, that the veil between worlds was thin. He threw a powder into the fire, which erupted in a shower of green sparks. From the smoke, a piece of parchment appeared to materialize on the stone floor. A crudely drawn map, supposedly showing the location of a hidden treasure. A disembodied voice, likely one of Prelati's hidden accomplices speaking through a tube, echoed through the chamber, promising that this was only the beginning. It was all a trick. A cheap parlor game at the end of an atrocity. But for Gilles, his mind reeling from the horror he had just committed, it was proof. It was validation. The unbearable cost had yielded a result. This single, staged success was the poison that infected his soul. It created a powerful, addictive feedback loop. The horror had worked, and if it worked once, it could work again. He now had a reason to continue, a reason to believe that this dark path was not one of damnation, but of salvation. Of course, the great riches never appeared. The treasure map led to a dead end, but Prelati had an endless supply of excuses, an answer for every failure. He was a master of moving the goalposts. The demon was pleased, he would say, but the offering wasn't quite enough to fully break through, or the astrological signs had been misaligned at the last moment, or perhaps the victim's soul wasn't as pure as they had thought, and they would have to try again with another. Each failure was masterfully reframed as a lesson, a reason not to stop, but to become more precise, more dedicated, more ruthless. This created a terrifying psychological engine. Gilles was now trapped in a cycle of sunk cost. He had already sacrificed one child, a monstrous act that had damned him forever. To stop now would be to admit that this soul-shattering crime had been for nothing. The only way to justify the horror of the past was to commit more horrors in the future, always believing that the final glorious prize was just one more victim away. One murder became 2, 2 became 10, 10 became 50. The initial goal was almost forgotten, lost in the grim, repetitive, and addictive process of the hunt. Over time, something inside Gilles de Rais began to change. Months, then years, of this cycle wore away at his original motivation. The desperation for gold, once an all-consuming fire, cooled into a bed of embers. He had become desensitized to the act of killing. What remained was the intoxicating feeling of absolute power. The rituals became less about the intricate details of summoning a demon and more about the theater of cruelty. He found a deep, sadistic pleasure in the godlike control he had over his victims, in their fear, in their pleas, in the finality of his decision to end their lives. He was no longer Prelati's desperate client, a pawn in a demonic bargain. He had become the director of his own depraved opera. The cruelty was no longer the means to an end. The cruelty was the end. Prelati, the brilliant conman, saw this shift with crystal clarity. He had intended to shear a sheep, but had instead unleashed a wolf. His role changed. He was no longer the master sorcerer leading a disciple. He was the facilitator, the court magician, now trapped by the whims of the monster he had so carefully helped to create. The hunt for the demon's gold was over, The hunt for children, however, had just begun. The monster had finally found a purpose that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the darkness in his own soul. By 1440, the fortress of Tiffauges was no longer a place of desperate magic. It was a predator's den. The hunt for demonic gold had been abandoned long ago, replaced by a much darker and more fulfilling pastime. For Gilles de Rais, the abduction and murder of children had become a routine, a ghastly form of recreation that punctuated the otherwise dull aristocratic life of feasts and courtly music. He had created a perfect, hermetically sealed world of absolute power, where his every whim was law and his depravity was a secret kept by a small, terrified circle of accomplices. He had gotten away with it for 8 years. The fear of God was a distant memory, and the fear of man was a concept he no longer understood. In his own small kingdom, he was a god, and the possibility of consequences had ceased to exist in his mind. It is this profound, pathological arrogance that sealed his fate. The unraveling did not begin with a clever investigation or a brave witness. It began with a petty squabble over church property. A local priest, Jean le Ferrand, had the audacity to challenge Gilles in a minor legal dispute. To the god of Tiffauges, this was not a negotiation. It was an insult, an insect buzzing in the face of a lion. He didn't plot or scheme. He reacted. He gave a casual, almost thoughtless order to his men. Get rid of the problem. They ambushed the priest in broad daylight, beat his attendants, and dragged him back to the castle dungeon. To Gilles, it was a minor exertion of his will, the swatting of a fly. He failed to realize that this single public act of thuggery was a thread, and if someone were to pull on it, his entire secret world would come undone. That thread was picked up by the Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Malestroit. The bishop was a powerful and patient man, a spider who had long been aware of the dark rumors that clung to the web of Gilles de Rais's domain. He was a political rival who knew that a direct move against a Marshal of France was impossible without an ironclad pretext. The clumsy public kidnapping of a clergyman was the pretext he had been waiting for. It was a gift, a legal and moral justification to finally act. The bishop launched an official inquiry, ostensibly to investigate the abduction of the priest. But he instructed his men to be thorough, to dig deeper. He gave them the authority of the church and sent them into the villages and farmlands that lived in the shadow of Gilles' castles. They were to follow the whispers. The investigation began, a methodical and politically savvy noose that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to tighten around the neck of a man who didn't even know it was there. Gilles de Rais was arrested, but the key to the entire case was not the arrogant nobleman. It was the terrified commoners who had served him. His henchmen, Poitou and Henriette, were apprehended and taken to separate cells. This was the moment the entire enterprise collapsed. They were not high-born lords, shielded by a lifetime of privilege and a belief in their own invincibility. They were servants, scoundrels who had participated in horror out of a mixture of greed and a deep, abiding fear of their master. Now, faced with a new and more immediate fear, the cold steel of the Inquisitor's tools and the certainty of a horrific death, their loyalty vanished. The interrogations were brutally efficient. The henchmen were offered a simple choice: die horribly for a master who could no longer protect them, or confess and throw themselves on the mercy of the court. The coven of cruelty, held together only by the force of Gilles' personality, broke apart completely. In a desperate cascade of self-preservation, they began to talk. The confessions of Poitou and Henriette provided the investigators with a roadmap to hell. They were no longer chasing rumors. They were following precise, detailed directions. The testimony was an avalanche of truth that buried any hope of denial. "Break down the new wall in the lower chamber of Tiffauges," they said. "Dredge the cesspit beneath the north tower at Machecoul." Armed with this terrifying knowledge, the investigators returned to the castles. The search became a grim excavation. Following the henchman's words, they found the secret graveyards. They unearthed chests of children's clothing. They sifted through the ashes in the great fireplaces and found charred bone fragments and human teeth. They broke down the walls and found the skeletal remains of boys and girls who had been hastily entombed. The abstract horror of the whispers had finally become a verifiable, physical reality. The case was no longer based on rumor or testimony alone. It was written in the bones of the victims themselves. The trial began. Gilles de Rais was brought to the courtroom in Nantes and confronted with the full, crushing weight of the case against him. The testimony of the dozens of grieving parents, the meticulous, signed confessions of his most trusted men, the grim, official reports detailing the bodies and bones unearthed from his own homes. He listened to it all as the web he never knew existed was revealed to him. He heard the verdict of the world outside his castle walls, and then he looked at his accusers, the judges, the men who held his life in their hands, and he smiled. A smile of pure, dismissive contempt. The evidence was absolute. The testimony was damning, but the investigators had made a critical miscalculation. You cannot threaten a man who already believes he is a god with the laws of mortals. The monster was caged, but he was not yet broken. The court had presented a mountain of evidence, and the monster had simply laughed. For the judges, it was a moment of profound crisis. How do you prosecute a man who refuses to recognize your reality, who believes himself to be a god beyond the reach of mortal law? Faced with this absolute, contemptuous defiance, they unsheathed their final weapon, one that had nothing to do with earthly justice and everything to do with eternal damnation. They began the ritual of excommunication. This was not a legal proceeding. It was a spiritual execution. In a solemn candlelit ceremony, the Bishop of Nantes, in full vestments, formally declared Gilles de Rais anathema, a heretic cast out from the community of Christ and condemned to hell for all eternity. For a 15th century nobleman, this was the ultimate terror. His body might live, but his immortal soul was now officially forfeit, abandoned by the God he had once so fervently served. The psychological blow was absolute. The God complex, built on a foundation of aristocratic pride and years of untouchable power, was shattered by a force he still, deep down, believed in and feared. The man who had abandoned God was now, in turn, publicly and irrevocably abandoned by him. When Gilles de Rais was next brought into the courtroom, the laughing monster was gone. In his place was a broken, weeping man, finally ready to talk. But the confession that followed was not the humble, whispered admission of a repentant sinner. It was a performance. Having been spiritually broken, Gilles' immense ego reasserted itself in a new and final form. If he was to be condemned, he would be the author of his own condemnation. His confession was a grand, final monologue, a last act of absolute control over his own narrative. He stood before the court, and with a chilling and meticulous clarity, dictated the story of his own damnation. He recounted the pact with prelati, the names of the victims, the precise methods of their torture and death. He spoke not with shame, but with an unnerving thoroughness, as if he were a general recounting a military campaign, ensuring every detail was correctly entered into the historical record. The court sat in stunned silence as the man they had caged willingly built his own legend, transforming himself from a mere criminal into an almost mythical figure of evil. He was no longer a defendant. He was the narrator of an epic, the star of his own monstrous opera. By confessing so completely, he seized control of his legacy, ensuring that the world would remember him not as his accusers saw him, but as he saw himself. The protagonist of a tragedy on a scale that no one else could possibly comprehend. With the confession given and the verdict of death a foregone conclusion, a final, strange transformation took place. Gilles de Rais, the director of his own myth, now became the director of his own death. In the days leading up to his execution, he meticulously stage-managed the entire affair. He composed his final words, planned the route of the procession through the streets of Nantes, and dictated the solemn, pious atmosphere he wished to create. He was like a playwright in the final week of rehearsals, ensuring every actor knew their part, every cue was hit, and the final scene would have the maximum emotional impact. He sent for the parents of the children he had murdered. In a scene of almost unbelievable audacity, he wept before them, begged for their forgiveness, and asked them to pray for his soul. It was a calculated act of public contrition, designed to frame his final moments, not as the just execution of a monster, but as the tragic, noble death of a great sinner who had found God at the end. Having lost all power over his life, he exerted a final, absolute power over the narrative of his death. The day of the execution was his premiere. He played the part of the perfect Christian penitent flawlessly. He walked barefoot through the streets, weeping and singing hymns. He addressed the massive crowd from the scaffold, not with defiance, but with a tearful speech on the boundless mercy of God. It was a masterclass in performative repentance, and it culminated in his final, most bizarre directorial choice. He requested to be hanged at the same time as his henchmen, Poitou and Henriette, but asked that his own rope be cut short so he would die first. He wanted them to witness his pious and fearless end, he explained, so that they might be inspired to save their own souls in their final moments. It was the ultimate paradox. A man convicted of unspeakable sadism was now positioning himself as a spiritual guide, a role model for a good Christian death. It was a performance so powerful, so seemingly sincere, that it captivated the entire city. The crowd, which had gathered to see a monster burn, now found itself weeping for the soul of a nobleman. The sentence was carried out. Gilles was hanged and his body was put to the pyre. But his final performance had been a stunning success. So moved were the high-ranking noble women in the crowd that they pleaded with the judges to spare the Marshal of France the final indignity of being consumed by the flames. The request was granted. His partially burned body was pulled from the fire and given to them. While his common-born accomplices were reduced to ash, the monster who had murdered their children was carried away in a solemn procession. He was given a formal, honorable funeral and buried in the holy ground of a Carmelite church. The law had condemned a monster. The church had buried a nobleman. With the final curtain call on his grand performance, the man was gone. But the stage was now perfectly set for history to forget the truth and embrace the legend. The law had condemned a monster. The church had buried a nobleman. In the end, Gilles de Rais was given 2 tombs, a physical grave in the holy ground of a church, and a historical one as one of the most profane criminals to have ever lived. From the very moment of his death, his story fractured into these 2 irreconcilable halves: the fallen, repentant lord and the unholy, sadistic monster. The world was left with a paradox that it could not solve, a story that was too terrible to ignore, but too contradictory to easily remember. And so, history did what it always does with a truth that is too monstrous to bear. It transformed it. Over the centuries, the specific documented facts of the case began to fade like a medieval tapestry left in the sun. The names of the victims, the political rivalries, the complex psychology of the man, all of it was worn away by time. But the core elements of the horror, the most potent images, survived. The story of a fabulously wealthy aristocrat with a dark secret, the image of a remote, forbidding castle, and the terrifying idea of a single forbidden chamber where unspeakable atrocities took place. These elements were distilled, purified of their messy historical context, and reborn as a fairy tale. The real-life horror of Gilles de Rais, the ogre of Tiffauges, became the timeless myth of Barbe-bleue, Bluebeard. The historical monster was laundered through folklore, becoming a storybook villain used to frighten children. It was society's way of processing an evil so extreme it defied rational explanation. The man had to become a myth, a dark archetype, ensuring that the essence of his crimes would haunt our collective nightmares long after his name was forgotten. We began this story with a stained glass window, a perfect shining image of a hero. That hero was real. His courage was real. His faith was real. And that is the final, terrifying lesson of Gilles de Rais. This is not the story of a monster who disguised himself as a man. It is the story of a man who was both a celebrated hero and an abominable monster. It is the ultimate proof that the capacity for sainthood and the capacity for unimaginable evil do not live in different worlds. They can exist together, side by side, within the same human soul. His life is a permanent, chilling warning about the terrifyingly thin line that separates the best and worst of our nature, forcing us to look at the heroes we build and acknowledge the dark shadows they cast. The story of Gilles de Rais forces us to confront the terrifying nature of a hero's shadow and the line where history ends and myth begins. What do you believe created the monster? Was he a devout hero corrupted by grief and black magic? Or was the monster hiding inside him all along? We want to hear your theory. Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you find these journeys into the darkest chapters of history as fascinating as we do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that have been lost to time. Click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching.